You've gotten a little bit of that, I've seen, over your book on panpsychism. They're trying to claim that's Jewish or some stupid shit. So I'd like to hear a little bit about your panpsychism book and what that's about and how that relates to like monotheism and Judaism or any of that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So panpsychism comes from panpsyche. Everything in the universe has a kind of psyche, which is a sort of consciousness or an awareness. And it's, sounds like sort of a bizarre idea, kind of a mystic sort of a thing, maybe Eastern religion or something. People at first glance, it sounds a little crazy, like everything has a kind of a psyche or a mind or a soul, I guess you could sort of say, if you want to use religious terms. But really, it's so I did a lot of research. This was, going back 20 years for my PhD. A lot of research on this whole idea. It turns out to be a very deeply held idea in the West by some very brilliant philosophers in the Western tradition. So it's not some fringe, crazy, lunatic idea. It's really a very mainstream idea that has fallen out of favor for certain specific reasons. So it sounds crazy at first, but it's actually has a long and noble history, and it actually has very solid arguments in its favor even today. So it's a really kind of an interesting sort of idea, but it's kind of particularly relevant as it relates to religion, because, as I explain in the beginning parts of my book there, Panpsychism in the West, it's really kind of like the original religious view of humanity. If we go back to the beginning of, say, human culture, so we're talking maybe 30 or 40,000 years ago, as far as people sort of had some conception of the world and themselves, they seem to have held what we would call today an animist viewpoint. So everything in nature was animated, right? So the animals in nature were animated, the trees and the plants were animated, the lakes and the streams and the forests and the mountains and the clouds in the sky, things in the sky. Everything was animated for original indigenous peoples. And that made sense. I mean, things had mysterious powers and they acted in sort of, intelligent sort of ways. There was a kind of logic to the way things happened in nature, and it made sense. There was a kind of a conscious awareness behind all this stuff. Over time, as we got a little bit more sophisticated, we imputed personal identities to those things. So there was a kind of a god of the wolf, or a god of the sea, or a god of the sky, or a god of the rain, So these became gods, like divine, superhuman beings, and we gave them names, and we created stories and mythologies about these guys. And so the first theology that came from animism was polytheism, right? There are many gods in the universe, and gods are behind the animals and the plants and things in the sky and so forth. So that held for a very long time. Things changed, as far as we know, with the coming of the pharaoh Akhenaten in Egypt. I don't know if you're aware of much of his story, or if you know about him. He was the father of King Tut, actually. He lived around 1300 BC, and he was apparently the first monotheist in history, 1300 BC. And he was sort of a really brilliant individual. I edited a version of his story in the book Son of God, Son of the Sun by Savitri Devi. I think it's on my book list there. So Akhenaten was kind of a brilliant thinker. He came up with this idea that the sun was the sole god. So there was like a one god system. There it is. Yeah, the sun was the god, and the emanation from the god, which was the heat or the energy, we would say, he didn't use the word energy, but the energy from the sun created everything. So it was a very monistic view from Akhenaten, and there was this one god of the sun, the Aten, A-T-E-N, the Aten was the one god. And it was really a really visionary, huge intellectual breakthrough to come up with this sort of idea. It's really kind of a striking story. That was 1300 BC. Akhenaten had a very short reign. He got overthrown. The priests didn't like his story. They sort of tried to obliterate his memory. They destroyed most of the records, and they went back to the old polytheism because that kept them in power. There was a whole power structure based around polytheism. They didn't like this new monotheism, so they got rid of Akhenaten and his ideas. So we bounced back and forth there for a while. Eventually, of course, along comes the Hebrew tribes in the Middle East. And they apparently, in the very early days, they also were kind of polytheists. But at some early point, they seem to have migrated to something like monotheism. when they decided that their one tribe was the best, the blessed, right, the chosen tribe, and that their one God was the best God. So they kind of moved to this view that, there's only one God, and it's our God, it's the Jewish God, and
And he chose us.
and he chose us, and we're the best, and everybody else is somehow different and subhuman and so forth, right? Um, so that was sort of one piece that was going on in the Middle East. In Greece, the Greek philosophers, this before they really even knew much about the Jews, this was about the same time, about 600, 500 BC. The Greek philosophers, they sort of also migrated towards monism, but they kept the polytheism, which now became something like panpsychism. So the early Greek philosophers, including the big name guys like Plato and Aristotle, were basically panpsychists. They sort of said, look, everything in the cosmos has a psyche, kind of a psychic component to it. But everything is kind of one, sort of one stuff. So there was the early pre-Socratic philosophers talked about everything was either water or fire or air. So we had these unified monistic worldviews combined with a sort of a panpsychism. And that was at the very basic basis of Greek philosophy, which is at the basis of actually Western civilization. So the Greeks were developing kind of this panpsychist idea. That the Jews, on the other hand, were pushing their monotheist view. And those came into conflict, right? Because if you got one God who's all powerful and he blesses just one little tribe of humans, you're really sort of monopolizing the spiritual or conscious power in your God and in your tribe, right? So there are no other gods out there. There are no other blessed people, right? Other human beings are basically animals, right? They don't even have souls. I guess there was some early Jewish theology that said humans don't even have souls, other humans. So there's panpsychism. So there was an interesting conflict where the Judeo-Christian view of a very hardcore monotheism struggled against the older polytheist panpsychist view, and there was kind of a clash of these two worldviews. And then, of course, as the Roman Empire collapsed over time and Judeo-Christian views took over dominance in Europe, then they brought along the monotheism. They brought along the monistic view of the Judeo-Christian God, and that pushed out the older ideas of the panpsychist views and the polytheistic views. So it was really kind of another defeat, an ideological defeat of panpsychism by Christian monotheism. And it's been a struggle ever since. It's been a struggle for 2,000 years. We had many big name philosophers since then who realized that panpsychism actually was much more rational view, and there's a few of them mentioned there: Spinoza, Leibniz, Schopenhauer, William James, Whitehead, Russell, and many more. There's a few dozen that are actually promoting that view. So it's really an interesting view that really is fundamentally in contrast with the traditional Christian view, which sucks up all the spirituality out of nature. There's no spirit in nature. There's no spirit in the animals, nothing in the plants, nothing in nature itself. It's all in God and heaven, and it's in human beings, and specifically only in Jewish human beings, right? If you take the traditional Old Testament view. So just really kind of an interesting contrast in ideas over time there.
So basically, it's like the pre-Christian, pre-Jewish understanding of the nature and divine and God. And it seems to be a little bit more plausible than what we read in the Bible.
Well, yeah, I mean, right. It was the dominant view in ancient Greece, right? All the pre-Socratics and Plato and Aristotle really bought into this view, and that was really the foundation of Western thinking. I mean, had that survived, as the dominant view, you'd have a whole different trajectory of history in Europe, rather than a Judeo-Christian view, which of course paints a completely different picture and introduces the concept of sin and heaven and hell and all that. We really had nothing like that in the polytheist and panpsychist view of the Greeks.
The contrast, it's almost like they see the world as divine, nature as representing God, whereas Christians in Judaism, they kind of see this world as like fallen and like worldly evil, and they're more focused on the afterlife and heaven. Is there any other examples of like the contrast between panpsychism and like Yahwehism, and how it results in like real world behaviors or actions?
Well, yeah, I mean, it puts people at home in the universe, right? So under the Christian view, we're even if you accept that all humans have a soul or a psyche, we're like bizarre exceptions to the whole cosmic order, right? Because under the Christian view, no one has a soul except us. No one's in God's image except us, right? God gave the world to us, not to anybody else. So we're this really exceptional, unique aberration in the whole scheme of nature. That puts a big burden on us, and it makes us like strangers in the world. We are like this like aberrant, mutant sort of creature that somehow doesn't fit in with everything else in the universe, because we're so different and unusual. And you get this, you could obviously play it up as a kind of a hubristic sort of thing, like, well, we're better than everything else, but that's seems to be pure nonsense. So it's kind of this idea that somehow we don't belong, which is really true. In a Christian view, we don't really belong in the world. In a panpsychist view, we fit very naturally and logically into the whole sweep of nature. We're part of a conscious universe. Everything around us is sort of a conscious, aware entities. We fit very naturally into the flow of things. We're part of this larger consciousness. We're maybe part of God in some sense. If you want to look at the whole universe as kind of a conscious entity, which we can certainly take that view. That's part of panpsychism. So it's much more compatible, sympathetic, integrated sort of view, where we're not strangers. We're actually part of the universe. We don't have this whole problem of sin and suffering, and threats of going to heaven and hell. All that goes away. All that sort of moral baggage all goes away, because you don't have that in a sort of a naturalistic panpsychist universe. So you can sort of compose a theology about it. It's sort of revering the entire universe as sort of a divine thing, divine cosmic conscious thing. But it's none of this heaven and hell, sin, blame the sinners, and please save me kind of stuff. That all goes away. So it's a really completely different conceptual outlook